and welcome to History After All. I have a very dear friend with me today. Alex Fitzgerald is with us today. We will be talking about quite an interesting topic. It's even more niche than what we usually deal with on History After All. We will be talking about the Central Asian Revolt of 1916 that took place during the First World War, and it's quite overlooked even in Turkey, even in Turkish historiography. It's not very much dealt with, let's say. But Alex is quite interested in the area and in the period. We intend to do one video on the Central Asian Revolt, and I am intending to keep Alex as a prisoner and make him do another video for us in the upcoming weeks or months about Afghanistan after the First World War, but that's as of now, that's limited to being an intention. We are recording this right after St. Patrick's Day, so it's I'm not in Dublin right now. I missed all the fun, but it's extremely and especially heroic of Alex to participate in this recording today. So Alex, welcome. It's excellent. It's great to have you on here with us. Welcome. How are you? How was yesterday?
Yesterday was great. St. Patrick's Day is quite the cultural celebration in Ireland. It's a lot of tourism, but I mean, if you're only here for St. Patrick's Day once in Dublin, I kind of feel obligated to take part, even if the traditional Irish people want to stay home and stay away from all the tourists.
So to paint a general picture, one, what attracted you to the Central Asian Revolt of 1916? What's so interesting about the period, about the topic, about the dynamics? Why is it intriguing? Why is it interesting?
Well, there's a couple things. We started, as you may have talked about before, we together took a class on global revolutions in our master's program about the certain age of revolutions that took place in the early 1900s and the late 1800s. And the Central Asian Revolt is one that severely goes under my historical radar, or severely went under my historical radar, as it seems to do in most historical radars, because the historiography is few and far between when talking about anything to do with it. And it obviously a lot was happening at the time, so it slips through the cracks even more. But it's also a region that goes untalked about for most of history until sometimes it pops up in its importance. But so much turmoil has happened in that region that it's hard to pin down one specific occurrence. And the Central Asian Revolt is extremely interesting in how it unfolded.
Who were the major actors, primary actors of the revolt?
You have to say, obviously, the Russian Empire, and specifically the administration of Turkestan, which was a general governorship within the Russian Empire. But it was, even though it was on the border of the Russian Empire, it was, in all intents and purposes, a colony. It was just as much of a colony as, say, Rhodesia was for the British Empire, and it was administered in an extremely brutal colonial way. Other actors would be the local cultural leaders of the specific areas within Turkestan. One of the most important aspects of this revolt is that there wasn't one major leader, and it wasn't just this unified movement against the Russian Empire. It was just a spread of violence and anger against the Russian administration during the war because of actions that the Russian administration took. Other minor players, you have to include the Ottoman Empire, because while they sent advisors over, they realized that there wasn't anything they could do to help or hinder the revolt. But if the general jihad had not been called in 1914, I believe, then this revolt may have not had a spark that it generally did. But it's actually argued for the historians that talk about it, mainly Alexander Morrison in English. It's argued that the jihad call may not have had as much of a impact as some people would think.
Our general idea as modern Turkish historians is that the call for jihad hasn't amounted to anything at all during the First World War. It was mostly for show, and it didn't do anything for the war effort.
Yeah.
On the Turkish side or the German side, but this is the very broad approach. Again, to paint a general picture, how was, if you're calling Turkestan a colony, how was and when was the area colonized, and why? How did the process move for the regional actors and the Russian Empire?
Well, there would be three major phases of Russian colonization of the region. It would start in the early 1800s, and it would move through until basically until the late 1800s, maybe early 1910s. And this is a very broad generalization, so I'm leaving a bunch of stuff out. But the three phases would be the Kazakh phase, where they pacify the Kazakh region, and then they would either colonized land that was very not easily controlled by the local khans or emirates within the region. Mainly, Bukhara was the biggest emirate, and Khiva. And within the mid to late 1800s, they would go to war multiple times with the local centralized rulers, either subjugating them or just completely annexing their territory. And by the time World War One rolls around, they have a complete control over the region, from Afghanistan being under British control nominally. From that border to Persia, everything north of that was controlled by the Russian Empire.
Afghanistan was the buffer zone between British influence and Russian influence, right?
Yes, in 1907, the Anglo-Russian agreement that Afghanistan was not privy to delimited the official borders recognized of Afghanistan, and it more or less, some may argue otherwise, but it more or less ended the Great Game, which had lasted since the late 1700s, where the British and Russian empires vied for control over Central Asia. And if that was the ending point in 1907, it's very clear that while Russia didn't control all of Central Asia, the most important parts of Central Asia, mainly the ones that could expose Russia to a southern invasion, were completely under Russian control.
Peter Hopkirk's book, The Great Game, I think it's called. It was published in Turkish, translated into Turkish and published some years ago, but it was also just as a side note for the Turkish audience. It was also published by Türkiye İş Bankası Kültür Yayınları as Orta Asya'da Gizli Savaş, Büyük Oyun. They can, if they're interested in the topic, it was recently republished, so it's accessible for the Turkish audience as well, if they're interested in the topic. What were you said there were three major phases of quote unquote colonization of Central Asia. What was the historical background of the grievances between the natives of the area and the Russian Empire? What were the problems between them? How was the region and its people treated by the Russian Empire? And why was there a problem or a collection of problems and troubles that led to such a huge revolt?
Well, this wasn't the first time, number one, that the populace of Central Asia, or at least a nominal majority of them, felt enough of grievance to take armed revolt into action. But in general, the major issues that arose within the central governorship of Turkestan was that they increasingly, by the time of 1914, had been taking away the cultural and regional powers of the local leaders. They not only did that, but they also heavily taxed Turkestan, and also brought settlers in. And in the late 1800s, there was a string of Russification of the non-Russian areas within the Russian Empire that was the most sweeping cultural washing of any areas that were not strictly Russian. They brought in Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians to basically create more settlers, and there arose a dynamic between the local natives and the settlers that had arrived, that were basically shipped in by the Russians. A lot of them were freed serfs after the abolition of the institution, once they had paid off their debts, or a different option. Instead of paying off the debt that you have accrued as a agreement for the abolition of serfdom, you can also become a settler and move into many of the regions they were doing it. But one of the most heavy influx of population was in Turkestan. So they heavily taxed them, they took away their local power, and they basically moved in a new class of people that automatically had more rights than the locals did.
When we say Turkestan, I keep pronouncing it in Turkish. Apologies if that's jarring for you. When we say Turkestan, do we mean just because I'm not very familiar with the area, are we talking about an area of people that were organized into tribes for the most part? What was the societal structure like at that time?
It's really complicated, and to try to say, oh yes or no, it wouldn't be correct either way. The most you would say modernized or Russified by the time of the revolt would be the Kazakhs. They'd been under the Russian Empire for the longest time, so they had kind of evolved into a more Western European style of living system. And you see that in the revolt because the most organized parts of the revolt are in the what became the Kazakh Khanate resurgent. Uh, there were an equal amount of steppe nomads and local peasants. That so the steppe nomads would not be centralized in one place. The local peasants would be farmers and centralized in one place, but they were viewed as the same within the Russian Empire, which was lower than the settlers. In the Turkmen areas in the west, they were the most nomadic, and they were the most, you can say, tribal, but that's kind of putting a spin on it that may not be great. But they were the least modernized of all the Turkic peoples. And the Kyrgyz as well were also very nomadic. They were the more nomadic people, and they shared the border with China. The Tajiks and the Uzbeks were more centralized around civic areas, but they still were not as quote unquote modernized as the Kazakh areas.
And the general governorship, it was headed by Alexei Kropotkin, a member of the Russian military elite. Who was he? Why was he chosen for the post? And are you aware how the general governorship was established in the area?
Well, the general governorship was a system not only in Turkestan, but also in all of the non-autonomous but not Russian parts of the Russian Empire. So there was a general governorship of the Baltic states. There was a general governorship of Poland. There was a general governorship at times of Ukraine. Sometimes it kind of got absolved into the Russian Empire, Greater Russia as a whole, but usually it was a general governorship. The general governorship of Turkestan was shaky. So it was under the same guy for most of the 1870s and 80s. And there wasn't any notable uprisings within that time. So Konstantin Petrovich von Kaufmann was the general governor of Turkestan from until 1882 when he died. In that time, there were no legitimate uprisings. He served in the conquest of Central Asia, which is basically what we talked about, the colonization and wars that took place in the 1800s. Another notable guy was Samsonov. He was general governor just before the First World War broke out. And if you know your World War I history, Samsonov is famous for losing the very first battle against the Germans and then promptly killing himself. Kuropatkin is a very special character when it comes to this because it wouldn't have been as bad if it wasn't for him. He also served in Central Asia for most of his career, and he learned a very authoritarian way of dealing with any kind of unrest within the region. He served under von Kaufmann. He was never officially labeled as general governor until after the revolt broke out. The general governor at the time had fled Tashkent and was sacked as soon as he got into Greater Russia. And Kuropatkin was named general governor, but more of a military. It was already a military posting, but it was more of a command to put down the rebellion. That's why he was given it.
Do you think we have painted a clear enough picture of before 1916? Are we missing any major pieces of information? Do we have the background complete?
I think we have broadly established a good background. I just want to talk about quickly the notable times where there have been uprisings in the past in the
Yes.
region. So one of, I think, the coolest and also the biggest and longest was Kenesari's rebellion, which was a Kazakh rebellion in 1837 to 1847, I believe, and it took 10 years to fully put it down. Uh, Kenesari was basically usurped the role of Kasik Khan when the individual Zhuges, or just individual kingdoms that had been subjugated by the Russian Empire, had realized that they were continuously just being slowly annexed and slowly integrated into the Russian colonial system. Kenesari rose up and fought a pretty substantial guerrilla war against the Russians. He never really engaged in direct combat until times where he thought he could maybe win. He usually just harassed lines for about 5 years, and he recruited some of the Kyrgyz Khanate's support. And there are arguments that he only started failing because the Kyrgyz Khanate was playing both sides because they realized they can't fight the Russians. And he was actually not killed by the Russians, but at the end of the rebellion, when it was clear that it was over, he was actually down south fighting the Kyrgyz, and that's when he died. That was like a major event in Kazakh memory, but also in the Russian colonial history, because it did put a dead stop to the Russian advance into Central Asia for 10 years. And it may have actually changed the way they approach Central Asia to where they would be more forceful and direct with their military confrontation, but also with their dealing with the locals.
Before the first revolt or before the first uprising, could you say the Russians were more mellow in their approach to Central Asia?
Well, yeah, but they were also limited by the time that they were in. I mean, this was the 1830s. Russia had no sense of railways whatsoever. Their military doctrines were very still Napoleonic. They were under the Tsar at the time was Nicholas I, who was just extremely autocratic and backwards compared to his son, who would be the one to free the serfs. So any reforms that were happening in the Russian Empire had not occurred yet. And by 1847, I believe Alexander I came into power and he instituted a lot of these reforms. But yes, it was more of just a frontier war, much like the British Indian War or British Indian Northwest frontier with Afghanistan. It wasn't as much of a direct advance into Central Asia until after that point. So yes, I would say they were more passive. It was still direct colonialism, but they were more passive and they were more willing to agree with the locals that they would have some sort of autonomy in Kazakhstan. After they got past the step of Kazakhstan, that autonomy barely existed anymore.
The second insurrection or the second revolt?
Oh, yeah. The Andijan rebellion in Andijan, which is in modern day Uzbekistan, in 1898. It was a very different rebellion from Kenesari's, but it showed that there was just this deep distrust and disdain for the Russians. I wouldn't call it a rebellion. I've different books that I've read have called it just a uprising or an insurrection. Basically, a mullah convinced enough people to completely reject Russian control over their own territory in Andijan, and they took a fort in Andijan that had about 1,000 men in it, and the revolt had about 1,500, and it was over in a day. They were all slaughtered when the fort called for reinforcements, but it was a significant turning point within the Russian view of the region, that these people are never going to fully accept that we have control of them, so we have to stamp down the boot even harder. Yeah.
The Andijan revolt, the fact that it was instigated by a mullah made me think of the possible religious character of the first uprising as well. The first uprising that took 10 years to suppress, did it have a significant religious character? Was religion a factor?
Not as much. Definitely not to the point of Andijan. And Andijan still was, it was religious, but it had a secular motive. It wasn't to cast the infidels out of Muslim lands. It was specifically the Russians are mistreating us. A local leader in that case would be a mullah. And that's what we see in the 1916 revolt as well. Many of the local leaders that had enough sway over the local population to convince them to either revolt or not revolt, in many cases, were the mullahs or the whatever ulema would be controlling the region. Kenesari's was too early in the 1800s to call it nationalistic, but it was a national liberation movement, as we would call one today, as much as we can call one today. I mean, the man was declared Khan of the Kazakhs when there wasn't really a Khan before that, because they had been split up into three separate kingdoms. And he, with the sole goal of preserving Kazakh lands from Russian influence. So it wasn't a grand jihad or anything that we can call anything like a holy war. It was strictly a national movement.
Does that bring us to 1916?
I believe it does. So 1916, as we know, the First World War is raging. It's a war that no one has ever seen the likes of before. And yada, yada, yada, it's a bad war. So the Russians are making some actually moderate advances in 1916 under Brusilov. They need a lot of work on their lines. They do not have as good as trenches. They do not have supply. They do not have railroads built enough to maintain the lines. That is the tactical and strategic situation of the Russian lines on the Eastern Front. Turkestan is excluded under the Inarodsi system. And we forgot to talk about the Inarodsi system, but the Inarodsi system is a system where any peoples ruled under the Russian Empire who aren't viewed as compatible with Russian laws are excluded from certain things, sometimes taxation, sometimes civil service. Those two were less influenced in Russian Turkestan because they were taxing them no matter what, and they kept taxing them more when the war broke out, which only heightened tensions between the administration and the local populations. Civil service, they were not allowed in anyway, so that wasn't a big benefit of the Inarodsi status. Inarodsi nowadays, it literally translates in Russian to of alien origin. It would be viewed as derogatory nowadays, but the Inarodsi status within Russian Turkestan was one of the only things that gave the people of Turkestan all over, no matter which culture they were, a sense of security of life, because one of the main issues was it excluded them from conscription of any kind. They did not have to serve in the Russian military. The Russian military didn't want them to serve in the Russian military because they believed that they could not follow orders, they could not be compatible with the Russian military system. And the irony is, if Russia wanted to integrate the people into the Russification system, including them into the Russian Empire military would probably help in a way that it did with the British Indians. But they weren't. And they began considering in 1916, early in 1916,
did the Inarodsi system come into effect after 1905?
No, it was a
When was it
system.
established?
It was a system that had existed since the 1880s under von Kaufmann. It was one of the reforms of the Russian Empire as a whole, but it really didn't affect, let's say, like the Ugric peoples in the north or the Siberian peoples as much as it had an effect on the pacification of Turkestan. They began considering conscription in early 1916 for rear line work, not combat, but rear line work. When this was discussed, rumors spread throughout Turkestan like wildfire among the local populations, because that was how news spread within this different cultures. And not only rumors coming from one culture to another culture, but also within the Russian settlers, almost antagonizing the people that they ruled over by saying, you're going to serve, you're going to have to go to the front lines. And that fear escalated into the cultures where they were going to have to go to the front lines. They were going to send us for basically cannon fodder. The truth was, the Tsar released an ukaz in 1916. An ukaz, just a proclamation that the people of Turkestan would have to provide X number of people for rear line work, railroad construction. Would be backbreaking and probably people would die, but it would not be a direct conscription for service. Once the ukaz was announced, there was no going back. People started completely attacking settlers, rioting that turned into armed insurrection. It really all civil order broke down within the region in a week.
But we're not talking about a central organization or a revolutionary committee, or as far as I'm aware, there wasn't any kind of revolutionary preparation for any kind of revolt in the region. It was all very out of the blue, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a wildfire in its easiest term. It sparked out of nowhere, anyone could probably see that something like that was inevitable, that there was just this built up of pressure within the colonial system there, that it just exploded. But there was no central leader, there was no central movement. I think that's a good point. There's no movement like any other revolution would have that led to this. And it wasn't like there was mass communication about preparing a revolt throughout the region. Just all individual communities that did revolt did it all at the same time, which shows that there was such a problem. Because if there wasn't, it wouldn't have been as widespread.
Was the just out of curiosity, was the Kazakh people the most prominent? Were the Kazakhs central to the revolt, or were any of the populations central to the revolt, as it were?
So it's very funny. So some of the fathers of Kazakh statehood under the Soviet Union would fight in this revolt, and they would be the most organized fighters within the revolt. However, they weren't backed by the official national movement within Kazakhstan, which was the Alash Party. The Alash Party actually tried to dissuade people from revolting against the Russian Empire, more because this is not the time to do it. This will only lead to harder life because we will get crushed and we will be further subjugated. But any national parties within the area of Turkestan, which most of them were only had international attention in Kazakhstan, did not take part. So the Kazakhs specifically were just as disorganized as the rest in terms of communication with other leaders. One of the best examples is when Kanat Abukin, one of the Kyrgyz rebel leaders, gets interrogated by the Okhrana under Kuropatkin, the Okhrana being the Tsarist secret police. When Kanat Abukin is captured and interrogated, tortured basically, he is not only shocked at the idea that he could be a national liberation leader, because that's what they thought he was. The Russian administration tried so hard to pin this revolt on one party, one group, one leader. Kanat Abukin didn't even know that it was so widespread. He thought it was only happening in the Kyrgyz areas. When he had heard that Tashkent had fallen to rebel activity, he was not only overjoyed, but also very shocked at the fact that, oh, the Kyrgyz national movement has moved all the way to Tashkent. And they go, what? It's a very funny story. And he actually gets released and then moves on to continue to siege Russian settlements within Kyrgyzstan. So there's no central leader whatsoever. And even in the Kazakh, which is more organized, it's not centralized whatsoever.
And the elite among different communities even tried to dissuade the people from revolting.
You mean the native elite? Yeah. So it was either or. Either they would dissuade the people from revolting, or they would be the proponent of the revolting. And it wasn't the kind of revolting you would think, let's all grab rifles and we'll march to Moscow. It was it was torches and pitchforks. I mean, it was surrounding settlers encampments or houses or administrative buildings, and there was a lot of massacre. It was not just soldiers versus soldiers. It was settlers, women, and children being massacred by locals in one city or village, and then it was locals being massacred by settlers in another city or village. So it was really intimate violence. It wasn't military conflict as we would view any kind of one, especially in 1916.
So how did the revolt itself unfold throughout 1916 and 1917?
Well, it really only, you could say that the revolt continued as there was just constant unrest, but it really only lasted for 1916 until about November. It's quite broad, but most of the revolt just completely dissuaded any confidence in Russian control over the region. And it led to a lot, but you can't say that it lasted much longer than 1916. The region originally had 10 million non-Russian people living in it, and about a million either died or left within the end of 1916. Something they call the Ürkün, the exodus, basically, because a lot of the Kyrgyz people had fled into the Tian Shan range in China. And
It's
you're laughing, I'm assuming, because I pronounced it terribly.
No, it's not Turkish per se, but it makes sense in Turkish. We would pronounce it as Ürkün in
Yeah,
Turkish, and it could be translated as Exodus, as you said, or also more accurately as the fright or the scare, as these people were frightened for their lives and
yeah,
they had to escape. The etymologically, I'm saying but
right,
the act itself was an act of exodus, of course.
right. And the most notable like research that you could do is the research about the reprisals that occurred in 1916 once the Russians took back control. Because once the men were there for them to advance back into Turkestan, there wasn't a hope of continuous fighting. It was they were there to put it down like dousing a fire. And the reprisals under Kuropatkin were wildly brutal and completely indiscriminate about who they assigned death sentences to. In some instances, every local leader, whether it was in a revolt or whether the village stayed out, like a lot of the Turkmen villages stayed out of the revolt because the news didn't spread, number one. Number two, some of the Turkmen locals in the north were okay with being drafted to construct certain things within the Russian lines. But even so, the Russians would hand out death sentences for most of the local leaders in a region where there was revolt, even if they didn't take part. Which is why in the Kyrgyz areas, many people left. But it wasn't just the Kyrgyz, it was the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Kazakhs. A lot of them fled or were killed. And by the end of it, like I said, 1 in 10 people either had died or left.
So we are talking about presumably uh, hundreds of thousands of dead or hundreds of thousands that were exiled, to be more
Yeah,
precise. Yeah.
the general it wouldn't be called conservative estimate, but the general estimate is that about 1 million either died or left. And to say, well, how many died or how many left, it would be impossible to say. The numbers are impossible to pin down. You can look at Okrana sources if you have the access to them, and the Okrana will either lie or overestimate how many they've killed because of whoever they're writing the source for. If they want to show that they've done their job, even if they hadn't, they'll say they killed more than they did. If they want to hide the fact that they're killing so many, they'll say they killed less than they did. But also the exile into China, into the Tian Shan mountain range, this region was also extremely volatile and completely inhospitable for any kind of grazing or farming or anything. So it's widely assumed that most of the people that left starved to death. So to say just that 1 million, it's safer to say that most of them died. And that's so if you want to be fair to the Russians, which I don't know why, you would cut it in half and say 500,000 left, 500,000 died, but the 500,000 that left probably also died.
So what was the effect of the revolt on the one Russian war effort? And secondly, is it considered a part or a precursor to the Bolshevik Revolution?
So it's very interesting how the Bolsheviks viewed the revolt, and even not the Bolsheviks, but the provisional government in 1917. The effect on the war effort, if you study World War One, you know that even though the Brusilov offensive was very successful in knocking back the Austro-Hungarian lines, there was no possible way that they could advance farther than their supply allowed. And by the time that they had quelled the rebellion, the Brusilov offensive was over. Did it hamper the war effort so terribly? No, I would not say so. They had to divert troops, but most of them were backline troops with backline material.
Do you know how many troops?
I think the estimate was about 100,000 by the late 1916.
I saw
Um,
somewhere a number around 150,000, but that tracks.
yeah, most of them were quote unquote National Guard. So men who were not on the front lines. The war was going bad for Russia anyway. So to say that this is the nail in the coffin, as if almost like the uprisings in Austria-Hungary, it would say yes or no. But how did it influence the Bolshevik Revolution? The provisional government, specifically Kerensky, And I have a quote from him, which is insanely racist, but does offer up how brutal this revolt and its repression had to be for the people of the Russian Empire to say maybe they've gone too far. Kerensky said, "How can we possibly blame a backward and uneducated and suppressed Aboriginal people so dissimilar to us for having lost patience and committing acts of revolt for which they immediately felt remorse and regret?" He visited the region once it had calmed down in 1917 while he was leader of the provisional government. And his ideology, much like the later Bolshevik ideology, was this was anti-Tsarist because the Tsar's system was so bad and so hurtful to everyone that it touched that they needed to revolt. So I have no sympathy for the Tsarist people that died. I have sympathy for the people that died here. But he still viewed it in a very colonial way and said, well, obviously this region is Russian, but this was a bad event. The Bolshevik Revolution, once the Civil War ended, because they didn't really have time to have historiography during, views it as a completely not wrong, but just skewed way of it being a revolution against the kulak class of Russian settlers or bourgeoisie farmers, which, yes, it was against the settlers, but not because they were kulak. It was because they were Russians. And the post-1991 Russian historiography puts it in a similarly problematic light of saying that this was just a Russophobic revolt. They don't say it's wrong for them to be Russophobic in that case, but it's not just because that there was this foreign race in their lands. It was because of how they were being treated by that foreign government. The Basmachi movement that arose in the Central Asian region was noted as a successor, almost like a ancestor of the 1916 revolt. But the Basmachi movement was a civil organization, and it had a central leadership, and it was it gained a lot of its influence from the 1916 revolt, and it was deep in the memory because it had just happened, but it wasn't a complete successor in a way.
So the Soviets were initially more sympathetic towards the revolt, the Central Asian Revolt, but it would be possibly wrong to say that problems were mended between any kind of Russian administration and the region. The problems remain. Did you say that?
Right. And it would be safe to say that while the Russian historians or the idealists may have truly believed that it was a righteous rebellion against this bourgeoisie class, but they also were trying to garner favor with the Central Asian states. You cannot say that, oh, the Tsarist reaction was justified, and then also try to have a autonomous socialist republic within the USSR. So the different republics within Central Asia that arose needed some sort of pat on the back for doing the not. There's no hard feelings. You were right to do this. This wasn't us. This was the people we fought a civil war against. We had the shared enemy at that point.
Any final notes on the revolt before we move on to the possible Ottoman influence on the region?
Only just a collection of useless facts, which is the basis of my future career.
You and me both. You and me both.
Yeah, seriously. There were many different places where the revolt happened, like I said, but the way that the local leaders had called for it differed in every case. And we can only pin down the ones where we know what happened. So I have a list of some. Mokush Shabdanov was a Kyrgyz leader in Bishkek. He was elected as Khan of the Kyrgyz, which was a secular title. And he took part in a lot of the same stuff that I previously mentioned Kana Abukin did. In other cases, like the Kyrgyz are the most documented part, which is why I keep going back to them. But there was a lot of uprising in Uzbekistan and the other places. But the Tsarist police heavily cracked down on the Kyrgyz most specifically, so they have the records there. Batır Khan Raimbek and I'm butchering every Turkic name possible, uh, was a cleric in the Kurdish region that called for a holy war against the Russians. So I just wanted to use those examples as, yes, in some cases it was a very religious based anti-Russianness, but there was also just this nationalist feeling of hate. So it can go either way. If you ask, is this religious or was this a secular movement? I would say neither and both.
It was a very natural revolt based on societal reasons, and it was very abrupt in its emergence, maybe, and it was not structured, it was not designed, it was not pre-planned, it was not administered from a central authority. So it was very, in that sense, I would like to use that word again, very natural in its political nature, maybe. Does that make sense? Am I grasping the general broad reality of the
Yeah.
revolt
And as
correctly?
historians, we have the benefit of hindsight in everything that we do. And it's very easy as a historian to look back at something and say, well, of course this was about to happen. However, you have to put yourself in the shoes of both the local population and the Russians within the region and say, we have complete control. But was this a natural progression of the mistreatment of the people of Turkestan? Yes. Would it have been easy to see that pressure was so heavily building up? Yes. But could you have said, oh, this wave of violence that had no communication between each other was just generally agreed upon without speaking in the entire region because of this one proclamation that just lights the oil barrel on fire? No, you wouldn't be able to tell that that was about to happen. But also, the oil barrel on fire is the entire Russian system during World War One. So it's just another part of the collapsing Russian Empire.
Maybe that's what makes it natural in that sense. It's a part of a larger whole.
It fits into the narrative
Yeah.
of the collapse. Yes.
Some Russian political leaders at the time believed there was German or Ottoman interference. Did they?
So that's notable. Some POWs had been moved to Tashkent during the war. Most of them were Austro-Hungarian, but they could have been any culture within that empire. And some were German. There was notably finally a railway that went from the north of Kazakhstan all the way to Tashkent. So that was the easiest place to put the POWs because if they broke out, they couldn't go anywhere. They had 1,000 miles of Russian territory all around them. However, once the revolt broke out, and specifically in Tashkent, which was the seat of the general governorship, was abandoned by the Russian administration, what we can only presume is that the POWs were broken out at one point. We completely lose track of them within the historical narrative. We don't know what happened to them. It might be safe to assume that some of them were killed by the revolters. It might be safe to assume that they tried to take up arms with the revolters and died. It is, at that point, is purely speculation, which I like to do, but I've always been poo-pooed by any teacher from doing so.
As far as I know, I'm by no means an expert on World War One or on Ottoman German intelligence activities or irregular warfare activities, but the Turkish intelligentsia at that time were interested in the region. They were aware of at least some of the grievances of the people. And some intellectuals who are very famous now in Turkey, namely Yusuf Akçura, as far as I know, they also traveled to the region
Mm-hmm.
and they gathered some information. But seeing as how disorganized the revolt itself was, it would be a stretch to assume that there was any kind of central point of interference by the Ottomans. And I checked before this recording some sources. Again, I am not an expert, but I checked some sources, and it seems that the activities of the special organization, as the Westerners like to call, or Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, the organization in the Ottoman Empire for irregular warfare. They were mainly concerned with helping out with the propaganda for
Right.
the Central Asian native Turkic people, because the Committee of Union and Progress had this Turanistic, this pan-Turkist vein to their politics. But still, they were very much focused on making the voices of the Central Asian natives heard in Europe. Whatever they did, they were almost completely, as far as I'm aware, limited to Europe. And what they did was mainly to publish some newspapers and magazines. And that's while it's commendable, I am not under the impression that it counts as a proper interference or proper help with the
Right.
revolt in the vein of irregular warfare. That's what
No,
I was able to gather.
I mean, this does actually tie into my thesis on Afghanistan in 1919 because of the Niedermeyer-Hentig mission that went to Afghanistan to try to get them to join the war against the British, who was their, in a way, overlord. There was also a Turkish party that went under Mahmud Tarzi to try to do the same thing in Afghanistan, Mahmud Tarzi being an Afghan originally. However, this was the path that they could get to into Central Asia because it bordered Central Asia, and they were allowed access because there was no border guards whatsoever by the time the revolt broke out. And of course, they would move through Persia and then get into Central Asia through Afghanistan. There was one Ottoman military advisor sent into the Kyrgyz areas, which are the areas that would most border the Afghan region. His name was Ibrahim Tuliyev. We remember we talked about him, and I could not find anything else about him, and neither could you, if I remember.
Neither have I been able to find anything about him. And his surname, and the fact that he had a surname at that point, because Turks did not have surnames up until 1924, makes me think he could have been a Russian Turk, or he could have been a native to Central Asia who lived in the Ottoman Empire. I
Mm-hmm.
have no idea.
His mission basically amounted to observe and report. And they did bring in some weapons to move to the Kyrgyz areas. They ended up in the hands of Kana Abukin, who would eventually siege Tokmuk, which was like one of the only conventional war occurrences within the revolt. But it amounted to, like you said, it was too disorganized to have a T.E. Lawrence effect on the Russians. And that focus would more be applied to Afghanistan, because if there was somebody that was going to really cause problems, it would have been Afghanistan, an organized country. So it was observe and report mission, and by the time he would get back to report, it would basically have been quashed already. So that's one of the most important parts about this. It was so quick. 9 months about is when you could say it happens, from May to November of 1916. However, again, this is easier to put yourself in the shoes of Tuleyev if it's so chaotic, disorganized, unagreed upon what the goals are, because there are no goals. It was just kill as many as we could find. How can you help that? Yeah, it takes away Russian effort from the war, but there's no possible way you could maybe prolong it so that it has enough of an effect that you can feel it on the lines that you share with the Russians.
Have we covered everything? Do we have anything to add? Do we have anything? I don't have any more questions. I think this was very comprehensive, and this was very 101 friendly, which I take care to do generally, because people watching this will not have heard of the revolt itself.
I guess I could say two more things. One of them being that, like it was well pointed out to me by our very amazing professor, Mark Jones, with UCD, this was a class about that originally that's how this found its way into my knowledge. This was a class about global revolutions. His question at the end of the class was, can we call this one part of a global revolutions trend? Is this a revolution? Does this count as anything that we would relate to the other revolutions that we studied, i.e., the Turkish constitutional revolution and other events like that? And the short answer is no. The long answer is there's so many different variants of revolutionary activity within this time in this region, and so many that come after, that this is just one little mark within World War One, and it's more of a event in World War One, like Ireland in 1916, that it was not a revolution because it didn't succeed, but Ireland had war goals. There was nothing like a war goal in Central Asia.
Also, some sort of organized and unified political revolutionary character that should
Yeah,
come.
nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it had nothing.
Yeah.
It was just a very tragic event of just mass violence because of built up anger. And the fact that it occurred in the most violent time possible in history up to that point, it was a tree falling in a burning forest. There was nothing, no one would know about it until the end of the war from the outside Russian and Turkish perspective. Just to make a note, there was still the Emirate of Bukhara in the south below Turkestan that was now a Russian vassal state. And it was a vassal state in the most medieval of terms. It was literally a monarch that swore allegiance to the Russian Tsar. He helped the Russians fight against the revolt. So he was seen as a traitor to his own people. And under the Bolshevik Revolution, he was not only removed from power because he was a upper class monarch, but he was accused of the Russians in the Bolshevik Revolution of fighting against his own people and being a traitor to his class. So it's a really weird mix of race, because they said he was a traitor to his own class because he's automatically a lower class than Russian settlers because he's Central Asian, but he's a monarch. And they accused him of being a decadent monarch, but also a traitor to his lower class that he was. So that's a very interesting historical fact.
You quote in your paper a sentence from Kropotkin, I think, that illustrates the approach towards the revolt itself.
Yes,
Would you like to reiterate his words?
I would. Yes, he has a quote from his time under von Kaufmann in Central Asia, but he continued to use it when he was quashing and reprising against the revolt. Early on in his time in Central Asia, he was quoted as saying, "It is necessary that they respect and fear us. They can love us later." And that is just a broad sense of how the Russians approached colonialism. It was absolute authoritarian colonialism, more so than the colonialisms from the Western powers that would be seen as still authoritarian, but with a facade of liberal democracy behind them.
Thank you. Let's briefly discuss sources before we close off.
Yes.
These sources are primarily in Russian, I would believe, but there are some Turkish documents pertaining to the revolt or to the region or to the political developments of the era. But still, most of the scholarly work conducted is by either Russians or the Americans and British. Is that correct?
So a lot of the scholarly work is newer. Ian Sokol is one of the oldest works on the 1916 revolt. His book is literally called The Revolt of 1916. That's from the late 60s, early 70s, I believe.
1954.
1954. Even earlier.
If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, even earlier. However, that's like one of the very few in English sources before the turn of the 21st century. The premier expert in English on Central Asia would be Alexander Morrison. And he talks about Central Asia. His focus is Central Asia in general throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. So this is just one part of his expertise. Alexander Morrison created a comprehensive work on the 1916 revolt, combined with scholars from all over the world, but mainly Aminat Shokabayeva, who was a Central Asian historian on the region from the University of Nazarbayev. It is probably the best possible work for anyone who is interested to read. It's called the Revolt of 1916 again. It is a edited volume by a bunch of different historians, but it approaches the revolt from every single possible angle you can. and I don't think if anyone wants to learn more about it, that is the where to start. And of course, if they're Turkish speakers, you have Turkish sources that you can recommend as well.
I would like to be corrected, but as I said in the beginning, I believe there are no dedicated books on the topic, but there are some articles. Some of them are worthy of attention, but I'm not sure I'm convinced. Again, I am not an expert on Central Asia. I am not an expert on modern Central Asian history, but I think the Turkish historiography could do better. So there is room for improvement there, a lot of room for improvement there. But there are some articles in Turkish as well. They can just, if they're interested in reading, if our audience is interested in reading articles in Turkish, my one recommendation would be just a second. Uh, for newcomers, I think this is among the more recent ones. The 1916 Turkestan isyanı, 1916 Türkistan isyanı, or 1916 Turkestan Rebellion by Seda Yılmaz Vurgun. I'm not sure if it's the most in-depth, but it may be the most accessible to newcomers, and it does include a lot of commentary from a lot of scholars. But there are four or five more that can be read in Turkish as well. But which of them really include original sources? Which of them are real meaningful contributions to the historiography of the revolt of 1916 as a Turkish historian that is considerably foreign to the period and foreign, not period, but considerably foreign to the region, I can say I'm not overly impressed with the work we have done on this.
Well, that brings us to the biggest problem of the study of the revolt. What is a primary source for this? All you would have is Okhrana documents, basically. And I don't speak Russian. I do not speak any Central Asian language. I barely speak a second language than English. We need historians. Late Tsarist imperialism needs to be studied more comprehensively in general, I believe. We need historians who can speak Russian to further study this and create works in English, because the Ürkün specifically is just such an ingrained event in Central Asian memory, but it's just so unstudied in English historiography, and if I'm understanding you, in Turkish historiography.
You are doing yourself an injustice. I know you do speak German. One question could be, did you check or are there any kind of meaningful, if not even primary sources, are there even any kind of scholarly work done on the topic by German historians or in German?
I looked through the German library websites that we have access to. No, there was a German historian whose name I'm completely forgetting, who was within the edited volume by Morrison and Chokobayeva. But any German historian writing for a broader international audience in general will usually have works in English as well. So no, I didn't find anything.
So this is a topic where there is a lot of room for improvement in almost all languages, but I do believe especially Turkish historians could do better, but it's very easy for me to say you need to do better as a historian that has no real conceivable intention of focusing on modern Central Asia for the foreseeable future. But I really, really admire Alex's dogged determination in uncovering this very overlooked period and region in history. And I believe his work is quite comprehensive. And he does have a habit of doing himself some injustice. So maybe we could see his work published somewhere, or we could see him in later but still foreseeable steps of his career doing something to illuminate, at least within the historiography in English, that could maybe uncover or bring this topic further into the public's attention. This has been a very long and I'm sure very disorganized sentence in English. I'm sure I made between 7 to 12 mistakes in trying to maintain this as one continuous sentence. I don't know why I do this. I do this in Turkish too. But
Yeah.
I'm generally more successful in Turkish. Generally, not always. So Alex, uh, if you do you have anything to add?
No, the world quivers before me when I finally have letters in front of my name. That's it. I think we've covered literally everything we possibly could from a comprehensive standpoint.
This has been one very much fun and
Yeah,
very enlightening for me. And this is very unique as well. No one's focusing on this in English. No one's properly focusing on this in Turkish. And now we, as a history channel, a very amateurish history channel, conducting studies, not conducting studies, but making videos in both Turkish and English, are now making a video in English. We have not reached 1,000 subscribers yet, but it's very niche and it's very unique, and I really enjoy this. It
it
leaves a
is
very
fun to
nice
just sit
taste
down
in
and
my
talk
mouth.
about. It's fun to sit down and talk about very
Yeah,
much.
yeah, I agree. And I absolutely hope to, in the upcoming months, talk about Afghanistan in the same period with Alex again. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us about this topic. And it has been a privilege to focus on this with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And thank you to everybody who watched, and we will see you in another video. Take care.